Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 635 for the 13th of December 2020. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia, where I'm up early. What time is it? It's just after 4 a.m. I thought, if I get up really early, if I get up very early, I can beat the noise, the birds, which seem to have invaded Sydney recently, the cockatoos, the rainbow lorikeets, and such like. The trucks, the heavy trucks that zoom up and down the street near here occasionally. The aircraft, which are increasing, I'm pleased to say. I must say that that's the fact. I am pleased to say there are more aircraft now since the borders have opened within Australia. So 4 a.m, I thought, yeah, that would do it. That would do the trick. Of course, I didn't take into consideration the flying foxes, or the bats. Yeah, they have a certain odd noise they make in the trees not far from here. But I think maybe they've just, maybe they've gone back to sleep. Anyway, one day I'll buy that soundproof studio with the rubber walls. Coming up on this week's show, our friend Ken McLeod. Well, an article he's written for the Skeptic magazine that's just come out, the Journal from Australian Skeptics, about Judy Wilyman, PhD. And in Ken's opinion, the PhD that was awarded to her certainly deserves a complaint of academic misconduct. And maybe after hearing his report, you may well agree. That's coming up at the top of the show, where I read his report from the magazine. And that is free for you to download. That report is free at skeptics.com.au. It's like a sample from the latest magazine. Following that, it's a trip back into Trove, a dive into the Trove, the treasure trove of online resources from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia. And we continue our thread from last week of water divining. This week we go to the year 1945 for a fascinating series of letters to the editor from skeptics and believers. And indeed, I've found even more interesting skeptics and believers from way back in 1912, 1913, which will be coming up in future episodes. But today, it's 1945. A quick introduction to the show this week. Don't forget to keep listening at the end of the show for more announcements from me and some very interesting news in the world of cryptography, just released yesterday. But now it's time for me to run downstairs, head for the kitchen, and I might not do anything except make a coffee because it's 4 o'clock in the morning. But later on, I've been inspired. Recently, I've been watching some cooking shows on TV, and I discovered a really fun way to watch a cooking show. If you and a friend, maybe you haven't seen for a long time, hook up with the phone or online, video, or just you can hear each other, and you more or less press play at the same time watching your various devices or TV or streaming services. You can watch the same show at the same time and simply comment about it and laugh and talk to each other. And that's a lot of fun. I really enjoy that. And it's inspired me to try some new cooking. Why not? Some lovely soup dishes and things like that. No, actually, I am going to run down the stairs and get that coffee. I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. From the Skeptic magazine, the Journal from Australian Skeptics, December 2020 issue, and that's volume 40, number 4. On page 37, Doctor at Large. Ken McLeod reports on how anti-vaccination campaigner Judy Wilyman is trading on her flawed doctorate and the implications for her, the University of Wollongong, and the community. When the University of Wollongong, UOW, issued a doctorate in 2016 to anti-vaxxer Judy Wilyman, concern and outrage was expressed by the scientific and medical communities and others who pointed out the multiple errors and misrepresentations in her PhD thesis. In, quote, a critical analysis of the Australian government's rationale for its vaccination policy, end quote, Wilyman described what she calls, quote, the political framework in which policy is affected by biased science or undone, underfunded science, end quote, and claims, quote, the existence of institutional barriers to carrying out independent research, including on topics unwelcome to groups with vested interests, end quote. She alleged collusion between industry and health authorities, particularly that the World Health Organization, quote, is perceived to be out of touch with global communities and is controlled by the interests of corporations and the World Bank, end quote. Wilyman did her thesis within the University School of Humanities and Social Inquiry, whose name was changed in 2014 from the School of Social Science, Media and Communications. It was this location which led commentators to refer to it as an arts degree rather than a science degree, something which Wilyman has taken exception to in an attempt to redefine herself as a science researcher. The thesis was supervised by Professor Brian Martin. The awarding of the doctorate raised the serious issue of the responsibility of the University of Wollongong to ensure that doctoral theses meet rigorous scientific standards. Wilyman's thesis has been widely criticised by qualified experts for not meeting those standards. The University of Wollongong has batted away those criticisms and should respond promptly. Wilyman, Martin and the University were awarded the Australian Skeptics Bent Spoon Award in 2016. Wilyman's thesis contains many flawed inclusions, too many to list here in full, although details can be found at tinyurl.com/Wilyman PhD. But just as a sample, page 105, quote, smallpox is only transferable by direct skin-to-skin contact, end quote. This is demonstrably false. Many Indigenous Americans were killed by smallpox, spread to them via contaminated blankets. The US Centers for Disease Control includes as transmission media, quote, infected bodily fluids or contaminated objects such as bedding or clothing, end quote, and, quote, rarely smallpox has been spread by virus carried in the air in enclosed settings, such as buildings, buses and trains, end quote. Page 121, quote, in the scientific model, it is assumed that the etiology of disease is mainly biological, end quote. It is not assumed, it is. Page 121, quote, allopathy rejects the theory that the mind, the emotions and the soul are involved as causal agents in the development of illnesses to its treatment, end quote. The soul? Really? Page 122, quote, if an agent, such as influenza virus, is known to cause an illness, it would be expected that all individuals exposed to the agent would get the illness. But this is not the case, end quote. It is not the case, and nor would it be expected to be so. Wilyman has set up a falsehood and then shot it down in an attempt to discredit germ theory. And all of these within just a few pages. Many problems were raised by individual critics at the time, including commentary in the peer-reviewed journal Vaccine, which questioned the quality of the thesis academic supervision and examination. Vaccine, volume number 34, pages 2467 to 2468. Martin responded that the commentary did not cite evidence-based sources, rather relying on, quote, newspaper articles, end quote, and suggested that, quote, it is good scholarly practice in such instances to seek primary documentation, including the views from both sides of contentious cases, end quote. A paper published in 2019 in Vaccine, volume 17, 1541 to 1545, does make that detailed commentary. This paper, quote, PhD thesis opposing immunization, failure of academic rigour with real-world consequences, end quote, was written by Dr. Kerry Wiley, Professor Julie Wilyman, and Professor Margaret Burgess, all of Sydney University, and Professor Peter McIntyre, National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. It addresses many of the main themes Wilyman raises, criticising the thesis on the grounds of uncritical analysis due to highly selected referencing, flawed arguments, misleading and broad assertions, and incomplete research. This paper is available on open access at tinyurl.com/Wilyman-vaccine. They conclude that, quote, this thesis is notable for its lack of evidence of systematic literature review. Despite its extensive claims, there is no primary research, but there is abundant evidence of strong bias in selecting the literature cited and sometimes outright misrepresentation of the facts. We agree that critique of immunization policy is a valid academic exercise and goes beyond technical knowledge, but equally it cannot be based on incomplete, flawed, and technical assertions, end quote. The critics call for a please explain review of the process of awarding the doctorate and the specific claims made in the thesis. The response. The immediate response was a defense of free speech. The university issued a statement that, quote, the University of Wollongong ensures research is undertaken according to strict ethical and quality standards and supports researchers' academic freedom of thought and expression. The University of Wollongong does not restrict the subjects into which research may be undertaken just because they involve public controversy or because individuals or groups oppose the topic or the findings, end quote. Martin dismissed concerns, saying that they were, quote, not genuine concerns about quality and probity, but instead part of a campaign to denigrate viewpoints they oppose, end quote. This is obviously a misrepresentation of the issues raised. They do not concern freedom of speech, but rather they criticize the thesis itself for clear scientific errors and misrepresentations, and the review process for apparently ignoring the serious flaws in the thesis. It was later revealed that one of the thesis reviewers, unnamed, as were all the reviewers, expressed, quote, serious concerns about the lack of engagement with existing literature and the lack of an appropriate theoretical framework, end quote. They also felt that the thesis showed no evidence that Wilyman conducted original research, nor that it demonstrated that she had made, quote, a significant contribution to the knowledge of the subject, end quote. Those concerns were put to one side, and another reviewer was found who presented a more favourable response. There was no review of the process that was used specifically to assess Wilyman's thesis gaining a PhD. Instead, this was a desktop review of the University of Wollongong's general processes. The University of Wollongong reviewed 18 policy documents which applied to the processes that led to Wilyman's PhD thesis examination and award. These documents were benchmarked against similar documents and processes used at 4 other Australian universities. The review's first key finding was that, quote, the University of Wollongong's wide policy framework relevant to HDR, higher degree research, students is compliant with the Tertiary Education's Quality and Standard Agency's Higher Education Standards and with the ARC/NHMRC Code of Responsible Research." End quote. The critics of the thesis had not attacked the University of Wollongong's general process, which did not need a review. The complaints were directed specifically at Wilyman's thesis, how it had been reviewed, whether it had been fact-checked, and how it had been supervised. The University of Wollongong did not review these matters. The University of Wollongong expressed confidence in its general procedures without checking whether these had been applied diligently to Wilyman's offerings. Scientific bona fides. Wilyman has taken a leading role in the anti-vaccination movement for some time, both in Australia and overseas, including presentations at anti-vaccination rallies and support for the Australian Vaccination Skeptics Risk Network. The AVN, under whatever name, has been a notorious provider of pseudo-medical information, regularly putting up claims that have been debunked. Wilyman has gone to great pains to stress her scientific credentials and authority concerning vaccination, with particular regard to her thesis. Wilyman's academic background begins with a Bachelor of Science degree at the University of New South Wales and a Dip Ed from the University of Wollongong. She then taught at high school in Wollongong for 9 years, followed by a Master's at the University of Wollongong, Master of Science Population Health. She began her PhD at the University of Wollongong, transferred to Murdoch University in Western Australia, where she was under the supervision of Dr. Peter Dingle. Dingle has had his own issues with alternative medicine treatments, particularly associated with his wife's dying of colonic cancer, having been treated with homeopathy rather than evidence-based medicine. The coroner in that case suggested that Dingle had contributed to his wife's death, quote, insofar as he supported and assisted with the homeopath's treatment and kept the deceased away from outside influence, which contributed to his wife's loss of a chance of survival. End quote. You can see a full report in the Skeptic magazine, volume 31, number 1. Wilyman says she lectured at Murdoch for a couple of years. Quote, lecturer and researcher in environmental and occupational health, Murdoch University, end quote. We have been trying to confirm that with Murdoch University, though the university has been unwilling to supply the information requested. During her days studying for a PhD, she would regularly sign off emails and letters as, quote, Judy Wilyman, PhD researcher, end quote, or, quote, PhD candidate, end quote, both unofficial titles, seemingly in an effort to add kudos to any arguments she might make. Wilyman then went back to the University of Wollongong to complete her PhD under Martin. While at Murdoch, Wilyman presented an anti-vaccination poster at a conference which had the Murdoch Uni logo on it. This greatly upset the university, with an email to skeptic Dr. Rachel Dunlop saying, quote, Murdoch has spent considerable time and energy in having the poster removed from various anti-vaccination websites and cannot allow the poster to be used in any format on any website, end quote. And of course, Dr. Rachel Dunlop, Dr. Rachie, is one of the original reporters right here on the Skeptic Zone podcast. In an interview on Perth Radio, it was suggested that, quote, a lot of the media reporting on you describes you as an art student, but you've actually got a Master of Science degree, end quote. Wilyman responded, quote, I'd like to give you a little perspective on my research because my background is completely scientific. After I completed my Master of Science in Health, I lectured at Murdoch Uni for a couple of years. My research was partly in the health department. Now it's in the social science department, end quote. The University of Wollongong PhD at the social science department is within the Faculty of Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. So technically, It is an arts degree. She put herself forward as an expert scientific witness in at least 2 legal cases in Australia and New Zealand that involved custody disputes between parents who hold different views on the necessity of vaccination. She has used the doctor title that her doctorate confers as a qualification to be a witness in such cases. Nonetheless, in those cases where there are summaries readily available, her testimony has been rejected. In a New Zealand case late last year, the judge dismissed Wilyman as not credible. She has even changed the name of her doctorate thesis in the signature block of her newsletters as, quote, "The Science and Politics of the Australian Government's Vaccination Program," end quote. To repeat, the actual title is, quote, "A Critical Analysis of the Australian Government's Rationale for its Vaccination Policy," end quote. No mention of science or politics, which indicates she is trying to recast it as a factual, science-based document on which the various reviews have cast serious doubt. She ran as a candidate in the Western Australian Senate in the 2019 federal election as a member of the anti-vaccination involuntary medication objectors, Vaccination Fluoride Party, later changed to Informed Medical Options Party. She is described on IMOP's website as, quote, "PhD specialist in government vaccination policies," end quote. The party did not win any seats at the election. The university's role. Overall, the University of Wollongong has given its imprimatur to a seriously flawed document that should never have passed even a cursory glance. It has given Wilyman a weapon to use in her attacks on vaccination, claiming a scientific support for her claims, which clearly does not exist. As the authors of the 2019 vaccination papers say, quote, "Almost 3 years after the event, the award of a PhD by a reputable university has validated the thesis claims and allowed the author to add weight to her subsequent prolific writings, including open letters to politicians and seminars to parents with consequences on a national and international scale. Tangible evidence of real-world consequences come from 2 sources. First, 2 of us, KW and JL, in our research with non-vaccinating Australian parents, find some who state that material in this PhD thesis and its endorsement by a recognised university supports their decision not to vaccinate their children. Second, the author of the thesis has put herself forward as an expert witness in legal proceedings where parents are in dispute over the need for their children's immunisation by positioning her status as a PhD graduate to assert expert status." End quote. Can the University of Wollongong revoke Wilyman's PhD? It can certainly revoke a degree and has done so in the past, notably recently with the My Master scandal of students from various institutions purchasing essays. According to the University of Wollongong's Higher Degree Research Award rules, the university can, quote, "withdraw an offer of admission where the offer is made on the basis of incomplete, inaccurate, fraudulent or misleading information supplied by the applicant or by certifying authority," end quote. HDR Award Rules, Admission Principles, item number 28. The consequences of Wilyman's promotion of her PhD to establish credibility with a general audience are considerable. If she is believed, the outcome could arguably be more preventable diseases, suffering and death, not to mention stress on the health budget. Wilyman, Martin and the University of Wollongong must take some responsibility for this. Hiding behind a defence of free speech is disingenuous and harmful, and something should be done. At the very least, a complaint of academic misconduct should be made, with the insistence that it be investigated by a completely independent expert. about the author. Ken McLeod is a campaigner against pseudomedicine and a founder of Stop the AVN. And once again, that comes from the very latest issue of the magazine, The Skeptic, the journal from Australian Skeptics. And you can download that article for yourself by visiting www.skeptics.com.au. It's like a free sample of the current issue. Don't forget you can subscribe to the magazine and have it delivered to your inbox or to your postbox, a physical copy, 4 times a year. And of course, as you well know by listening to the Skeptic Zone, all the back issues, bar the last 4 of the Skeptic magazine, going back 40 years, are available free for you to download at skeptics.com.au.
ただいま聞いていただいているポッドキャストはオーストラリアから The Skeptic Zone という科学と論理のポッドキャストです。英語は世界中で数ある言葉の一つですが、このポッドキャストはいろいろな国の言葉で紹介します。www.skepticzone.tv を調べて、ホームページの下までにスクロールすると、折り紙のピガサスという翼のある豚を工夫したリッチャード・ソーンダスのオリジナルの折り紙のポスターをダウンロードをすることができます。
Now, on last week's show, we were looking at water divining, water dowsing in the pages, the digitised pages of Trove, the online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia. And we discovered some correspondence from the year 1912. Well, this week, we're going to go forward to the year 1945 to an interesting series of letters written by skeptics and believers. January the 2nd in the West Australian, and the heading, Water Divining, A Skeptic's Impressions. To the editor. Sir, in regard to recent letters on the subject of water divining, it is not about time that this maligned cult, this hyperclan of innocence, was accepted by us lesser mortals, or else debunked altogether. If their claims are true, if this power is legitimate, then here, in our very midst, are the most grandiose revolutionaries the world has ever known. Here are men who shall turn science upside down, confound the universe, but save our civilization nevertheless. They shall give hope to the forlorn, succor to the dying, and elemental Vedancy to the desert. Surely they ought to be encouraged, or painlessly exterminated. That's a little bit harsh. Each and every rural area is plagued by a galaxy of those cognoscenti, some of whom admittedly display a remarkable degree of sincerity in their hallucinations, whilst others cloak their ignorance in a very imposing manner, lending very similitude to their caterwaulings by the most amazing gymnastics. Some use fork branches from green bushes, others prefer the bushes to be dead. Some use straight sticks, others used fossilized relics of no particular form. Some use wire bent in an appropriate, specified, personal, and proved shapes, ranging from the likeness of a V and L, back and forth through the alphabetical complex and the incomprehensible hieroglyphics of their own imaginations. Some use crowbars. Some wet their hands, some dry them, some walk barefoot, whilst others wear rubber soles. Some put salt in their mouths, some put silver. All display the most pathological exhibitionism and pseudo-modesty that it is possible to conceive. None has heard, apparently, of autosuggestion or muscular fatigue, of inertia or of Newton. When a stream is discovered, then for some the divining tool of their choice turns irrevocably down. For others it turns irrevocably up. For others still, the L-shaped wire, devotees, it turns irrevocably around and around, simulating a psychopathic interpretation of incoherent electromotion. And I have heard, from quite an unimpeachable source, that with some more romantic conjurers of this ilk, the whole earth trembles, spots appear on the sun, cows go off their milk, little babies howl, and so profound is the shock, the poor suffering diviner himself, overcome with grief, emotionalism or something, generally suffers a complete breakdown and is invariably confined to his bed for an indeterminable time. Incontrovertible proof, surely. But perhaps I am being a little too vitriolic. Perhaps I am a little too intolerant of, quote, water diviners, end quote. Perhaps even a little skeptical. Ah, well, perhaps I am. But then I have tried a half dozen of them, each varying from the others in his degree of proficiency, each with bona fides and credentials of the most conclusive type. And I have been mildly amused, though not impressed by their contortions. Some have affirmed where others have negated. Some have condemned where others have eulogized. What sort of uniformity is this? Does the stick exhibit such vicissitudes if the power is constant? Vicissitude. Noun, plural vicissitudes. 1. A change of circumstance or fortune, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant. Oh well, there's one more word for your vocabulary. Of the 6 celebrated diviners, 2 have coincided with regard to a particular spot, but symptomatic of the irregularity and inexactness of the superstition, they denied each other violently with regard to a second spot. How can their claims be justifiable when, in a route of less than a quarter of a mile, wherein 10 spots have been variously selected by them, we have the above ludicrous result? Or is it that of every 100 diviners, 99 are spurious? Their creed is unique in that it has no coherency, no order, no theory, no conformity of practice, is dowsing by science, yet lauded to the skies by unadventurous minds. It glories in its own little evanescent ego, but only, alas, in those self-same temples where the witch doctors are accredited paramount. Yours, etc., Tos Kargotchik Byford. Wow, them's fighting words. In fact, they're lots of words. This gentleman writing back in 1945 certainly knew how to turn a phrase. Very interesting. Of course, he can't just write that without people responding. And I have discovered several replies to his column, his letter. And let me have a look. Here's one from the same newspaper, the West Australian. Now, this is dated the 4th of January, 1945. Water divining. A skeptic answered. And this is by A.J. Wheeler from somewhere called Kalamundra, which I'm not familiar with, but that's what it says. A.J. Wheeler, Kalamundra, writes, in regard to a letter in the West Australian headed A Skeptic's Impressions by Tos Kargotchik of Byford, it would appear that he has never heard of the British Diviners' Society with a membership of 507. in 1943. This includes some of the highest military officers as well as scientists. Before the war, France and Germany had divining societies with high memberships. And that's undoubtedly true. Does he know that when the war started, Hitler formed a corps of 4,000 water diviners, and that the British Medical Association has formed a branch society of radiesthesia to study and practice divining from a medical angle? Does he know that Miss E. M. Penrose was appointed official water diviner to the British Columbian government? And that Major C. A. Pogson, MC, was loaned from the British Army and was appointed official water diviner to the Bombay government for a period of 4.5 years, and that 90% of his successful locations were in tracts where orthodox methods had failed? It was estimated that the sum saved through the instrumentality of the water diviner in excavating in unfavourable places was considerable. Far from the creed being disowned by science, science now admits the reception of radiations from matter by the human agency. Will Mr. Kargotchik deny he possesses the faculty of natural automatic human television with sound effects when he sees and hears a car passing along a distant road? What's that got to do with it? I'm not sure. With regard to the dipping and rising of divining rods, persons vary in polarity. Also, and I'm afraid the next word is smudged, so I can't quite make it out. So it says also something sticks and metal rods are substances of opposite polarity. Even a meter needle is known to move in opposite directions with positive and negative polarity. And finally, it has been proved by scientists investigating divining that thought transmission, human radio, as an interference to a diviner's working is a fact. And this was in 1945. They're telegraphing weird and wonderful excuses for divining failure when tested by skeptics. Perhaps the biased mind of Mr. Kargotchik prevented the diviners accurately working. Wow, there you go. From 1945. I would not knowingly work under those conditions myself. Wow, special pleading much? And here we have another reply from H.S. Kilpatrick, Midland Junction. Your correspondence, tossed Kargotchik, in his supercilious attack on water divining, exhibits more egotism than éclaircissement. They really loved to use flowery language back in 1945. I have seen water divining practice in 3 of Australian states by other people and myself over a period of 50 years. So far as telling if water is sweet or salt, I have never experimented in that matter, nor at what depth it will be struck, although the lay of the country will give helpful indications in this regard. But I can vouch for the following. If there is water under the ground, the divining rod will find it. You can also tell if the water is stationary or moving. If there is an underground stream, there is no trouble with the divining rod to follow it. The divining rod will also indicate if the supply is ample or meagre. I am not a professional water diviner, but for friends in many places I have tried the rod, and their subsequent sinkings in every instance have verified the method. Fools laugh at their own folly. And the next line says, quote, a convinced skeptic, end quote. Some years ago, an estate near Melbourne was cut up into blocks and I, amongst others, paid our deposits and took possession. One day a stranger arrived with his son and told me he intended to dowse for water. Directly I heard him say, dowse, it brought back to my mind the word dowser, which I had known since a child, but had not heard in Australia, and I wondered whether it was the origin of wowser, both words being associated with water. Now, for those of you internationally, and presumably this is the same meaning as used today. A wowser in Australia is someone who basically is a teetotaler, doesn't like raucous behaviour or drinking alcohol, that sort of thing. The only water available at the time was a tap where anyone could take his kerosene tin and help himself. In many cases it was a long way to the tap. So the man and his son cut a forked stick and started to douse. I was standing by laughing and exclaiming, quote, "Surely you don't believe in that old woman's yarn," end quote. Nothing happened. The stick did not move. Suddenly he said, quote, "Here, you will take the stick and see if it will work for you," end quote. I walked about and the stick pointed down, hurting my hands to hold it. A well was dug and within 20 feet abundant water was discovered. Since then, I have found that the stick works for me wherever there is water. The puzzle, however, remains, why does it not work for everyone? And the next entry we have here says, quote, "O'Grady," end quote, Carlisle. I have seen a lot of water diviners in my travel, having been a prospector, borer and well sinker in Queensland, New South Wales and the West since 1895. I find that I would sooner put my faith in the man who takes notice of the strata than the man with the twig. I will give 2 experiences I had with these supposed water diviners. I was camped with about 20 other prospectors. We were getting a little gold, and along came a diviner. He said he could locate either gold or water. I had a small nugget, about 5 or 6 DWT, and DWT is a pennyweight. We put it only 5 or 6 inches in the ground, then made a square of 15 feet and told him there was a piece of gold in the square. We had to get the dry blower to find it. Another time I was sinking a well when along came another diviner. Quote, "You won't get any water here," end quote, he said. Quote, "I have been all over here with my rod," end quote. I had already put a bore down and got water. Now here's one published on Saturday the 6th of January 1945, the West Australian, and it seems to be a reply to Mr. Kargotchik. It says, "Water divining, a challenge." To the editor. Sir, if Mr. Kargotchik intended his recent letter to demonstrate his command of the English language, it was an excellent effort. If it was intended as a criticism of the art of divining, a subject of which his ignorance is colossal, it was a flop. We have had many Kargotchiks in the past, and they are quite as numerous today. They condemn what they do not understand. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've heard all these arguments before. Mr. Gillette met one in a government servant who generously offered him his expenses if he guaranteed that, when sent to Narogan, he would find a stream within the town site at a depth of not more than 100 feet, producing not less than 22,000 gallons daily. He may have laid down those conditions with his tongue in his cheek. On the other hand, he may have been exhibiting the same ignorance as Mr. Kargotchik. Mr. Gillette undertook to find water only if it was there, not produce it. In Mr. Kargotchik's letter, I can find nothing but the vapourings of one who certainly has no knowledge of his subject, and his vulgar abuse of the diviners leaves me cold. He says, quote, "Perhaps," end quote, he is too, quote, "vitriolic, intolerant, sceptical," end quote. I would add, quote, "and ignorant," end quote. And I do not mean, quote, "perhaps," end quote. And now I would like to give Mr. Kargotchik a chance to back his opinion in a practical way. I am a diviner in a modest way, and during the past 50 years have seen the art proved on numerous occasions. Recently I divined some sites for my son on his farm, and I throw out this challenge to Mr. Kargotchik. I will take him to the farm, I will follow a stream for, say, half a mile, more if he desires it. He may select any spot on the line that he likes, and I will provide a man to bore on it. About a day will do. If the bore fails to locate water from 25 to 40 feet, I will forfeit £50 to any charity and pay all expenses of the trip and the labour. If I locate water, Mr. Kogotchik will forfeit £50 and pay all expenses. I am only an amateur. It will be interesting to see if Mr. Kogotchik is prepared to back his opinion with hard cash. Yours, etc., T.G. Halbert, London Court, Perth. That's absolutely fascinating. Imagine that, a water diviner prepared to put his money where his mouth is for a test of his abilities. Now, the next reference I'm finding to this interesting thread here is from the Army News from Darwin, Northern Territory, on Sunday the 14th of January 1945, and it's very fuzzy, a little tricky to read. It says in one of the columns here, for the past week or so, there has been a controversy in a West Australian newspaper over water divining. Mr. Thomas Kogotchik, who ridiculed the so-called art as having no scientific basis, says in a further letter that he has apparently stirred up a hornet's nest. He now states, and it's just a little hard to read, it's just a bit too fuzzy. He now states, in reply to Mr. T.G. Halbert, well-known Perth land salesman, quote, why does not Mr. Halbert guarantee so many thousands of gallons of water per day divined by himself in the properties he holds up for sale? What a fortune he is losing, end quote. What a treasure hunt this is through the years. We have the next in this series. Here we go. The West Australian on Friday the 12th of January 1945, page 7. Water divining. Answer to challenge. To the editor. Sir, I feel honoured that my recent letter criticising, in a humble way, the inconsistency, inanity, and inapprehensibility of water divining has stirred a hornet's nest of ire amongst its credulous disciples. Does Mr. Halbert really believe that I will accept his idiotic challenge? Does he imagine that anything will be proved or disproved by this proposed piece of private research? Why does not Mr. Halbert guarantee so many thousands of gallons of water per day divined by himself in the properties he holds up for sale? What a fortune he is losing. If Mr. Halbert desires to exonerate, quote, water diviners, end quote, from the suspicion under which they are held by the vast majority of people, then he should carry the diviner's burden before the high altar of scientific vindication. One locality as a test is useless. Mr. Halbert might know that locality perfectly. He would have to repeat his prognostications with 100% accuracy, or thereabouts, in a district as far apart as, say, Kalgoorlie, Albany, Alice Springs, Darwin, Dongwara, and Marble Bar, to all of which he must be transported blindfolded so that he would not have a chance to check the geological characteristics of any particular area. Further, he would have to compete against a trained geologist who, of course, would be free to use, as he wishes, the data of any geological survey. He would have to submit himself to a panel of scientists for examination, cross-examination, and general scientific analysis. I shall not be interested in any reply by Mr. Halbert, except in so far as it may exceed his initial effort in vituperation and flatulency. Yours, Tos Kogotchik. And immediately after that we have, under the heading An Invitation, L. H. Wilbury, Pinjarra, One can easily imagine that after penning his lengthy diatribe against water diviners, Thomas Kargotchik read it 6 times over and congratulated himself on a very smart piece of writing. To me, one fact seems to creep out of the mass of verbiage in his vitriolic outburst. This is that Mr. Kargotchik has been the victim of too many practical jokes practiced by pseudo-diviners alive to his warmth of feeling on a much-debated art. To say that water divining is disowned by science doesn't mean a thing. Even scientists will admit they still have much to learn. Mr. Kargotchik's experiences with diviners have been most unfortunate, but should he come to Pinjara, I will introduce him to a quiet man whose gifts in this direction have been utilized without question by most successful farmers in the district over many years. Incidentally, the diviner I refer to is a close reader of your paper and enjoys day by day discussions on the news therein. Yet he has completely ignored recent correspondence on divining, for the simple reason that he has never questioned his own powers and is intolerant of skeptics. And finally, we have one more reply, which was published in the West Australian Friday, the 19th of January 1945. Water divining, challenger and skeptic. To the editor. Sir, Mr. Kargotchik leaves me very little chance of prizing that £50 from his cash box. I am sorry he thinks my challenge idiotic, but I sympathise with his efforts to hang on to the £50. Certainly, I think something is proved by what he calls my private research. If I can find an underground stream, what does it matter if I pinched the knowledge from someone else as long as the water is found? As Mr. K has evidently got cold feet, I shall make it easier for him. He can choose any locality he likes, as long as he pays the expenses of getting there and produces the £50 when I locate water. I did not claim to state at what depth water could be found, nor the quantity. I guarantee only a stream, although I have a good idea whether it is a strong or weak stream. I leave definite depth and quantity to experts. I pick sites for my clients when asked, but not being a professional, I do not charge, and at my time of life I am more interested in that £50 than in making a fortune. One client, a manager of cattle stations in the far north, one of the localities Mr. K invites me to test, told me in that his 35 years' experience he had never put down a well or a bore without first having the site tested by divining. The concluding part of Mr. K's suggestion, if I may borrow his description, is idiotic. He suggests that I be taken out to any spot from Albany and to the northwest blindfolded, the blindfolding to prevent me from seeing the geological formation of the country. Here again he displays his ignorance of the subject, as the formation of the surrounding country enables the diviner to choose the most likely spot to find water. As for cross-examination by geologists and other scientists, this is all piffle. I do not claim to be able to answer any questions put to them. All I claim is that I can separate Mr. K from his £50 by my ability to divine water. Yours, etc., T.G. Halbert. And there we go, and I think that line sort of peters out after that. It's difficult to find more references to that ongoing back and forth. Maybe the editor had had enough. So even though the opinions of Mr. Kargotchik have been borne out through the experience of many decades, his attitude certainly leaves a lot to be desired, and indeed I think he just liked using long words. The proposed test he put forward was completely impractical and a bit silly, really. But what a fascinating series of letters back and forth that was from all those years ago. 75 years ago, they were debating the merits of water divining in the pages of an Australian newspaper. So why not visit trove.nla.gov.au and see what you can find yourself. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Now, right here, I have a book kindly sent to me by the Victorian skeptics called Tricky Nick, the completely true, not at all made-up story of the greatest magician in the world. Now, this is by Nicholas J. Johnson. It's a terrific book here. It's a really fun read. What does it say here? I am Tricky Nick, the world's greatest magician. This is my absolutely not made up story of magical greatness. Magic changed my life, and it could change yours too. And I love the bit here in the book. It says, Nicholas J. Johnson is a magician and author. He has spent the last 30 years lying his pants off. He lives in Melbourne with his family and his pet elephant, Morris. And this book is available from Pan Macmillan, Australia. But if you want to look that one up, just Google Tricky Nick by Nicholas J. Johnson. And it reminds me of how important magic, conjuring, I should say. The conjuring arts are to skepticism. They were one of the reasons skepticism got started when magicians like James the Amazing Randi, the late lamented, could see when people were using conjuring tricks to fool people, not for purposes of entertainment, but to basically fool them out of their money or to gain leverage or power over them. I think I can hear that bat. That bat's woken up outside. Did you enjoy the Skeptic Zone, bat? Anyway, a great read, so I can recommend Tricky Nick. And thank you. Thank you to the Victorian Skeptics for sending me a couple of copies of that book. And that was because I was a guest at their Skeptics Cafe. And don't forget, on the 21st of this month, you can tune in to Skeptics Cafe from the Victorian Skeptics and see Associate Professor Paul Willis, an old friend of mine, a paleontologist. Now, other people who may well have been up at 4 or 3 o'clock in the morning are the team of people, one from Australia, one from Belgium, one from the United States, who just in the last month cracked one of the codes left by the Zodiac killer, who was a serial killer in the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 1960s, and left behind, by way of letters to various newspapers, codes, encrypted messages. Some were cracked at the time. Others have just sat there being worked on continuously for over 50 years. And one of them was cracked. It's just fascinating. I'm absolutely enthralled, having followed the Zodiac story for many years. There's a wonderful video on YouTube now from the people who cracked the code about how they cracked the code, and it's fascinating. I will certainly link to that in the show notes. Now, this particular cipher is called the 340 cipher, and after all these years, and this has been confirmed by the FBI, and it reads, probably accurately, I hope you are having lots of fun trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise. So they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise. Death. Ooh, that is just so chilling. An interesting point made in the video of the way they cracked the code is Zodiac made errors. He simply made errors in constructing his code and errors in spelling and so forth, which compounded how hard it was to crack the code. And also it occurs to me he was far too clever. He really made a strange, bizarre code and made it very complicated to try and decrypt it. So after 51 years, in a sort of an odd way, it may have even defeated the purpose of him sending a code to people to decrypt. Anyway, I'll link to that in the show notes, and I recommend you watch that video. It is just enthralling. And congratulations to the team of people, including mathematician Samuel Blake from Melbourne, who cracked the code. I think now there's a strong possibility the rest of the ciphers could be cracked, because that certainly introduced a new way of looking at the codes, I would think. Thank you to those people who continue to support the Skeptic Zone, Patreon or PayPal at skepticzone.tv. Thank you to the new Patreons who've just come on board. And hopefully by now the little goodies have reached you in the post, including a little folded origami Pegasus from me and some other bits and pieces. Shout out to Maynard at maynard.com.au. If you missed Maynard's live Christmas special, you can go there and see the replay. And you can download Maynard's calendar for 2021. In fact, I'm going to be doing just that. I'm going to be downloading Maynard's 2021 calendar and printing out a few as Christmas presents. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders at some crazy hour of the morning, signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello to the afterthoughts, the people who listen after the music. This is the part of the show where I roll a die. What is it this week? 10. I normally roll a 10-sided die. Something I quite like about that. It's a good round number. I'm going to roll it 3 times and, well, I always say use your psychic power or your dumb luck. Well, just guess. Just guess. Guess along with me. In fact, that's something I've never done. I've never guessed myself. All right, I'm going to do that. Where's my Skeptic Zone pen? It's not really a Skeptic Zone pen. Actually, it's an Australian Skeptics pen. Okay, I'm going to write this. I guess. It's a D10. 10. So I'm going to guess 10. All right, here we go. First roll. I think it's going to be 10. 9. Oh, well. Close. Second roll coming up. I'm going to guess 5 because I know Susan is. Susan Gerbeck from Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia. Hi, Susan. Yeah, okay, well, it's 7. Okay, one last go. Here we go. 3. Why didn't I just say 5? No, I'm going to say 3. 3 this time. It's 5. This week's winning numbers, if you're playing along at home, are 9, 7, and 5.